Hey friends, it is chrisloewen here with another episode from our Outside the Walls podcast. We have already had 3 amazing conversations with 3 very different guests. We started out with hearing from Dr. Arlie Lowen, and then we heard from Gerksen, and then 2 weeks ago we had a conversation with Dr. Steinbach. Also, if you haven't taken time to check out our very first pilot episode where we introduced the overall vision and the direction for this podcast, I would encourage you to go check that out. You will be able to find a link in the description below for that first pilot episode. But maybe just to reiterate some of the main ideas that was said in that pilot episode, this is a podcast where we have a variety of conversations with people of different perspectives from what many of us will normally encounter in everyday life. The ideas and the topics that we have discussed with each of these episodes, both in the first 3 episodes and in future episodes, they're there for us to consider. But there is no expectation, no pressure for everyone to agree. Nor are these even official position of Crossview Church. Their desire that for this podcast is to learn through healthy dialogue from a posture of curiosity without feeling the pressure to agree with everything. That is the overall goal and the desire of what we're trying to do with this podcast. All right, so in today's episode, we have a good friend of ours on the show named Dr. Gregory Board. Greg is an American theologian, a pastor, and an author. He and his wife, Shelley, reside in St. Paul, Minnesota, along with their 3 adult children, 3 biological, and 3 adopted grandchildren. Greg is one of the founders and the senior pastor of Whitnine Hill Church in Maplewood, Minnesota, and he is the founder and the president of Renew Ministries. This has been a conversation that krisduerksen and I have been looking forward to for some time now. So without further ado, please welcome to the show the one and only Gregory Boyd. Hey, Greg, how are you?
I'm doing very, very fine.
That's awesome. You know what? I've been really looking forward to the conversation. Greg, you have been someone that I've looked up to over the past few years, and we've never met in person, but we've met once before in the kind of a venue, and so you know what? I've really appreciated you. So,
well, thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Yeah, and me too. I think this is my 3rd or 4th Zoom call with you, Greg. So I enjoy these Zoom calls. And just for everybody listening, actually, the name of the church where I'm the pastor here, Crossview Church. Ultimately, we got the idea for that name. I had read your book several years ago, Cross Vision. I really enjoyed that book, and just the whole idea of reading scripture through the lens of Jesus just really captivated me. And then out of the title of that Cross Vision came this idea of the name for a church, Crossview. So
I should sue you for plagiarizing.
Yeah, you should. For everything I have.
They say plagiarism is the highest form of honor. So, no, but I'm really honored that book made such an impression on you and actually helped influence your church name. That's great. Crossview, that's a great name.
You bet.
Yeah. So what we're going to do today is we want to hear your story. And then from there, we're going to kind of shift into talking about your view of scripture, your view of inspiration, which is something that Chris and I are really excited about. So, Greg, why don't you start off by telling us your testimony of how you came to Christ?
How I found Jesus.
Yes.
Well, I started dating this gal, this really cute, wonderful woman who was a Christian, and I wasn't. I was an atheist. And I don't recommend, dating evangelism, but God works in mysterious ways. I was always asking, I was always wondering if there's life after death, and is there any kind of higher intelligence, or is there a point to this whole thing, or is it just? I always was thinking about that, and so I always talked about it when I would go on dates or whatever. And so she invited me to her church because she thought I would find it interesting. It was this kind of radical holiness Pentecostal church, which I don't know how much buy-in she had to that, because she was dating me, and you were not supposed to date outside of this church. But I went to it, and it was strange. People raising their hands and crying and a lot of emotion, but something about it made me want to go back. And I went back week after week, and after about, I guess I've been going for 6 or 7 weeks. And then they had a revival or a camp meeting kind of thing. And this church was associated with this Bible school. And so they would give the Bible students a chance to preach at these revivals. And I went to this one on a Friday night, and this young lady was giving her first sermon. And it's interesting because though they were holiness Pentecostal, super conservative and everything, they did allow for women preachers, which was progressive by a lot of other evangelical standards. And this gal, I have no idea what she was talking about. She seemed kind of nervous, whatever. But then at the end of it, she says, if you want to receive Jesus into your life, come up here at the altar. And so I went up there, and I gave my life to Christ. And I had an encounter with God that was just boom. I mean, it was wild. It was to this day, I will say that was absolutely real. That doesn't endorse. See, but then I thought that means that this church believes whatever they believe is right. And it took me a while to work that out. But that's how I came to Christ, was in this little Pentecostal church. I was 16 years old.
Wow.
So did you? It sounds like you had one of those intense. I mean, you had an intense conversion experience. Did you have sort of the intense sort of afterglow? For how long did the afterglow last for you?
Oh, in some respects, the next 9 months was an afterglow. I mean, this church put a premium on experience, having experiences, and a lot of it, I'm sure, was just emotionalism. You get worked up, you get a crowd going. But there's times where God, I really believe I encountered God there. I mean, the trouble is that that's all they had. Once you start asking kind of intellectual questions, you're in trouble. But there's this glow, and it was the only time in my life where I actually had a sense of certainty. I had never had it before, and I've never had it since. But I was just sure that this group had the truth, and I was sure that the rapture was going to take place any moment, and I was sure that Henry Kissinger was the Antichrist, and I was sure that we had who the beast was, and we had it all down, and it was because it was a really apocalyptic group too. We were always just, any moment come back, and I lived in that for about 9 months, and then the honeymoon came to a very abrupt end.
So now you got us all curious. Like, how did the honeymoon come to an end? What happened?
I took a class. First, I took two classes. Took two classes at the University of Minnesota to blow my faith. The first one was a class in evolutionary biology, and because you had to take one class in science, and so I, being on fire evangelist, I was going to go take this class, and I was going to save this professor and convert the class, because I read 3 whole books defending creationism against evolution, and I thought I knew my stuff. And I had my note cards, I took notes and everything. So I would go in there, and the professor would start talking about something or other, and I'd raise my hand and I'd raise an objection. Yeah, but what about? And this guy, part of what made it so bad is that he was so nice. He would just, well, you see, blah, 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 and he would just carve me up. It just very gently. And then I raised another question, and I was always asking these questions. And after about 3 weeks, some of the students started to get mad. Like, will you tell him to stop asking all these questions? But the professor defended me. He goes, well, it's good to question fundamental assumptions, and all the rest, which I really didn't like, because taking his class, I thought he'd be an evil evolutionist. You could see he's godless, and this guy was just the opposite of that. And so by the end of that class, I had come to the conclusion that there's something true to the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and there's some truth to evolution, and that's all I knew. And I did not go with the literal view of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 that I was taught. My pastor used to teach that if Adam and Eve weren't literal human beings, and if it wasn't a talking serpent, and if it didn't take place in 6 literal days, then the whole Bible might as well be a book of lies. And that's at the same time I was taking a class in the New Testament as literature. And I thought this would be just an easy class, because I knew my New Testament back and forward. I thought this would be an easy class. But it approached the New Testament very critically, with a critical historical lens. And they just started pointing out, incidental things would drive me crazy. That, like, he would nonchalantly point out that there's 2 different accounts of the temple cleansing, and they're out of order. But that was no big deal to him. But to me, it was like, what? There's a contradiction. And And so those two punches were enough to do me in. I lost my faith. It took about 3 months. So overall, a year after I gave my life to Christ, I lost my faith. And then came the next year was like the most miserable in my life, because I was a pretty happy atheist before, or maybe I was agnostic. It kind of went back and forth, but it didn't. I was content with life being meaninglessness. It puzzled me that it's odd that it would not have a point, but I accepted it. But once you've tasted meaning, and you have a purpose, and you think you know what's going on, and you have this security, and all of a sudden it falls apart. That was hard going, and
Wow.
I wanted to believe so bad. But I couldn't. I just could not reconcile things. And of course, in this church, if you walk away from the truth, it's because you have moral sin in your life. And so they were always,
Oh, yes.
immediately they went to that conclusion. The truth was that wasn't it at all. I was so depressed. I had trouble having moral sin in my life. I was at this frat party where, kids are falling on each other, fornicating like flies, and getting higher than kites. And I'm sitting at this thing, and I'm disgusted with it. This young girl trying to hit on me, and I was disgusted with her, and she was kind of cute. But the meaninglessness of it all, it's like, don't you realize that we're just like rabbits? This is just pointless, meaningless. I was just depressed. So it wasn't I tried to get into it. It'd be nice if I could, and I was mad at myself that I couldn't. It was so frustrating because I was having this. My brain said, this has got to be okay. This is just, we're just animals, and so we can act like animals. And yet my gut was saying, this is wrong. Life should be more precious than this. And so I was mad that I couldn't even say why I thought it was wrong.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
Greg, I'm curious, how did the church that you were a part of at that time, when you fell away from your faith, how did your church family walk alongside you in that? Or maybe they didn't at all.
Oh, no, they didn't walk alongside. Now, the minute you say that you no longer believe it, you're public enemy number one. Now that doesn't mean everybody in the church, thinks you're an enemy, but they're warned about you. They're you got to watch out for that. It's and yeah, so I basically didn't have any contact until after I got my faith back, and then I regained some of the friendships there. But me and that girl never got back together.
And so how did you, so this is such a wonderful testimony. I just love the uniqueness of how God works in different people's lives. So you're an atheist, agnostic, you radically give your life to Jesus, you have a bunch of experiences with God. Then because of some intellectual questions, you leave Christianity, you leave your faith. Now you're depressed. So what brought you back to Christ then? How did you come back to faith, and how long did that take?
Okay. So for about 9 months, I just lived as I read a lot of Nietzsche, a lot of Sartre, a lot of Albert Camus, and these existentialists, and I'm trying to do this existential thing, but my heart is saying there's got to be more, there's got to be more, there's got to be more. And the problem was I couldn't find an intelligent Christian for my life. my first year in university, the few Christians I ran into were all buttheads. They just were, they preach, and I finally met in a philosophy class a guy who was a calm, rational person, and we started having these dialogues. And he was an evangelical, but he turned me on to C.S. Lewis. No, actually, before that, I'll tell you this: that I went to a professor of mine, who was a professor of philosophy, who I knew was an atheist, and we talked about atheism a few times. But this one, I went up to him and I said, "How do you go on living when you know that we say, well, we want to leave the world a better place, but eventually it's going to get worse, and it's going to eventually collapse into the sun. The sun will be a supernova, and all the rest. And in the end, it's all meaningless. It's pointless. How do you find hope? How do you keep going?" And he says, "Oh, when I was a young man, I was very troubled by that. I understand." A book that I read was very helpful. It's Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. And I still have it over here. And see, Sisyphus, the whole book's based on this this Greek hero or tragic hero who chose to defy the gods and go back and live one more day of life so he could avenge his death. His wife killed him, so he wants to kill her. And he's told, okay, but if you stay longer than that one day, you'll be condemned for all eternity to push a boulder up one side of a mountain and have it roll down, and you got to push it back up and roll down, and that's what it'll be for all eternity. And so Sisyphus returns back to life, avenges, he kills his wife, but he falls in love with life, and he chooses to stay and go on for one more day, knowing that he'll be condemned for all eternity. Now, Camus says this guy is heroic because he's choosing to live eternally, even though it's absurd to do so. And this is what we're presented in life. The guy, when I got the book the next day, and I spent the whole day reading it, I blew off my classes because, I wasn't thinking suicide, but I also couldn't think of any reason why people go through the bother of going on. And the first line, I believe, reads something like this. The only really important question is, why shouldn't we commit suicide? And so the book is the answer to that question. And its answer is that the reason we shouldn't commit suicide is because it's more heroic not to. Think about Sisyphus. You spit into the wind. Yes, we're absurd. We're freaks of nature. There is no point. We're miserable. We long for things that the universe doesn't supply, and yet choose to go on just because, damn it all, I'm going to go on. And when I got done with that book, I was thinking, if this is the best anyone has to offer, I think I'm in trouble. Because where do you get the value of being? Who cares if you're heroic or not if there is no value? It's like you're more authentic. So it's like, anyways, that got me wondering, how could it be that we human beings who evolved from nature have longings that nature itself doesn't meet? We long for meaning, and yet there is no ultimate meaning. We long for things to make sense, and yet there is no ultimate mind. And we long for good to overcome evil and for love to win. And yet, if atheism's true, death wins, not love. So how is it? How do you explain that? Because in every other instance, whatever animals nature produces, it's because it will meet the needs that they have. They fill a niche. So we're evolved to just find a zone and find a niche that has evolutionary advantages for us. But there is no evolutionary advantage to longing for meaning if there is no meaning. And there's no explanation for why we would long for ultimate meaning if there is no meaning, or a reason, or good overcoming evil. Well, then when I met this guy, and he turned me on to C.S. Lewis. I was reading Mere Christianity. C.S. Lewis makes that exact same argument. And man, did it resonate. And so here's this guy, I'm tracking with him. He gets me. And he just lays out such a case for Jesus there. Now, that wasn't enough to reconvert me, but it was enough to get me curious again. And so I started digging into the Gospels, started studying some of the history and stuff. Never did quite agree with that. My friend who was still holding to inerrancy, and so we'd have discussions around that. But he was a great friend, and his influence, I think, was God used him really to bring me back into the faith. I crawled back into the faith. I didn't like reconvert. It was an inch by inch kind of a thing. It grew on me, and now I am here where I am today.
Oh, I love that. Now, Greg, I'm curious to know, in that journey back to Christ, obviously your view of divine inspiration kind of came to life during that. You want to tell us a little bit about your view of divine inspiration in the Bible?
Sure, yeah. I wrote a book on this called Inspired Imperfection.
Which, by the way, is a phenomenal book.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I was for the longest time caught in this tension between, like, on the one hand, I feel I came to the point where I feel I have very good, compelling historical reasons for believing that the Gospels are generally reliable and that Jesus is basically who they say he is. Not saying that they're inerrant or inspired or anything, but just treating the Gospels as historical documents, applying the same kind of critical filters that you would use on any other ancient document to assess its truth value. Doing that, I come to the conclusion that these they give me every reason to believe they're credible. And they would to anyone who studies it, as long as, and here's the big if, as long as they're open to the possibility that the story is true, that the supernatural can happen. If you're open to the possibility that the story the Gospels tell is true, they give you every reason a historical document could give you for accepting that it is true. But if you don't accept miracles, then no amount of evidence for the reliability is going to convince you of that. You know at the start that they're unreliable because they report impossible things like miracles. You see how it works? So I believe Jesus is Lord. I have good reasons for that. And there's other things as well, like the argument I just gave you, the longing for purpose. And we could go on and on about that. But the thing about Jesus is that he clearly believed the Old Testament was fully inspired. And there's some indication that he pre-authenticated the New Testament. He told the disciples that the Holy Spirit, will come upon you and bring to remembrance all the things that I've said, and the world will believe in me through your word, which could imply some kind of a writing. So I want to affirm this whole thing is inspired. On the other hand, everyone kept on telling me that if it's inspired, it must be inerrant, without any kind of errors. And I just couldn't. I've been over that block before. I've been around that bush before. You can't convince me of that. For several years, I tried to just redefine inerrancy. And this is kind of what a lot of academic evangelicals do, especially if you're going to work in an institution that requires you to sign a statement of faith on inerrancy. So you go into, is it inerrant according to the author's intent or God's intent, or does it be inerrant? Is it inerrant in faith and matters, but not inerrant maybe in his scientific things, and you make all these kind of distinctions. And I finally came to the conclusion. This is why I wrote Inspired Imperfection. But I have just seen too many examples of, especially young people, coming to the conclusion that the Bible is not inerrant, that it has errors, and then they walk away from the faith. I met a guy on this airplane that we got to talking about stuff, and he found out that I was a Christian. And he goes, "Yeah, I used to be a Christian back when I was really on fire. I went to a Bible school, blah 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 blah." I said, "Oh, what caused you to lose your faith?" He says, "Well, I read this book in archaeology and showed that the book of Joshua, with all the Canaanite invasions and stuff, that it's not really rooted in solid history. And so if I can't believe in that, well, then the whole Bible might as well be a book of lies." And I think that's just so tragic. And so I finally got to the point where I gave up. I saw that it's dangerous to believe in inerrancy. I'm not going to try to defend that word anymore. It's not a helpful word, and people are losing their faith because of it. Because while I might have a very nuanced view of inerrancy, if you're telling it to the person on the street, they think it means without any errors, because that is literally what it means. And it doesn't take much work at all to show that there are errors in the Bible. It's got errors. It's got a lot of, just normal human mistakes. And so, yeah, I was always in that tension.
By the way, do you have any for examples that you could just throw out there off the top of your head?
Oh, yeah, it's like, was Jesus walking towards Jericho when he healed the blind man, or was he walking out of Jericho when he healed the blind man? Were humans created before animals, like Genesis 1 says, or were animals created? No, humans created after all the animals, like Genesis 1 says, or were human created first and the animals afterwards, as it says in Genesis 2? I could give 1,000 examples of that. In fact, Gleason Archer wrote a book called The Encyclopedia of Biblical Difficulties. And it is an encyclopedia.
I've seen that book. Yeah.
It's got that many difficulties in it.
Yeah, hundreds and hundreds of pages.
It is. It's I think like 400 or 500 pages. And
for people listening, Gleason Archer is a Christian scholar.
Yeah, a very conservative Christian scholar, and he does as good a job as you can at trying to reconcile these things.
Yeah.
But at some point it gets exhausting, and it's like, if you got to work this hard to defend it, maybe we need a different perspective.
Yeah. So Greg, you mentioned, there are people who, when they first encounter these problems, they just give up on faith altogether. But for you, did it deepen your love for Scripture?
Yeah, it has. I have a much deeper appreciation for Scripture now, precisely because I can accept it as it is. I'm not trying to make it something it's not, and I now see the humanness of the Bible as part of its inspiration. It's part of its beauty.
Right.
And it's interesting that the most decisive thing that God has done in history is become incarnate in Jesus Christ, and he dies for us on the cross and raises from the dead to confirm that his death on the cross was atonement and confirm that he was the Son of God. And this is the definitive revelation of God. This is what God's like. This is how God communicates to the world. And yet Jesus on the cross is bearing the sin of the world. All right. And he's manifesting the ugliness of that sin. I mean, he is experiencing not only the sin, but also the curse that goes along with it, the God abandonment that goes along with it. And yet that curse, that abandonment is what reveals God.
Yeah.
So that's like, I think that our starting point, when we're thinking about God, we should immediately go to Jesus Christ crucified. This is the quintessential revelation of what God is like. God is love, 1 John 4:8, and then 1 John 3:16 says, here's how we know what love is. Jesus Christ gave his life for us. So God his essence is Christ-like love. So if God can reveal himself through the one who bore all the sin in the world, do you think it's really a challenge for God to reveal himself through a couple of human mistakes? Is that really going to be a big challenge for him? And see, my core conviction, and sorry that my voice is kind of raspy. I'm just getting over a chest cold.
No problem. No problem.
This is my sexy FM voice here, man. My very white voice. Can't get enough of your love, baby. But, the thing is if Jesus reveals what God is like, and he does, Paul says that the cross is the power of God. And to the world, it's foolishness, it's weakness. But to us, the cross is the power and the wisdom of God, which is crazy by world standards. Usually we think the gods are supposed to be living in palaces and getting the red carpet treatment and getting all this stuff. But Paul says, and the gods are the ones who have power to crush people and to get their way and impose their will on people. But Paul says that this helpless crucified Jewish man is the power of God. This is what God's power is like. And what he's saying is that God's power is the power of self-sacrificial love, other-oriented love, humble, servant-like, kenotic love, a love that pours itself out for the sake of others. That's what God's like. And so if that's what God's like, that love is never coercive. Love is always respectful of the personhood of the other. And so I don't think God is coercive. God works by means of loving influence. But he'll never reduce us down to robots. He'll never just give us a lobotomy to change our minds on something. He works through a long, slow process. And that's why Revelation is so progressive. Over time, people get it. A little more, a little more, a little more. It keeps on going. And so if you believe that, then you can't think of inspiration as some kind of dictation, as though every word they're saying is going to be exactly what God wants, because that he'd have to do a lobotomy to go that way. So my belief is that God influences the biblical authors as much as possible in the direction of truth. But when he stops short of coercion and thereby lets them be who they are, see things as they are, they're not ready to change yet. But he keeps on influencing. He stays in the game. He comes alongside of Israel and works with them patiently, slowly, to change their minds, to woo them. And but that means that, so when we read the Bible, we've got to know that, yes, we'll see God breaking through, revelation happening, but we also will see human stuff that God allowed to stay in there, because God didn't want to coerce them. And now that we know what God really looks like in the person of Jesus Christ, we have the lens by which we can tell the difference. Whatever conforms to Jesus Christ points to Jesus Christ. It's a preamble to Jesus Christ in the case of the Old Testament. And that's the Spirit of God breaking through. But whenever we find things that are contrary to the character of God that's revealed in Christ, well, that's an indication that there God is humbly allowing the people to go on believing what they believe, because he won't coerce them otherwise. And that also points to Jesus Christ, because God is bearing the sin of his people and the imperfections of his people. And if we learn anything about God in the person of Jesus Christ, it's that he's a sin bearer. He didn't just start doing that on Calvary. He's always been like that. And so the ugliness we find in the Bible, some of the ugly stories, as well as the human mistakes and things like that, that points to the ugliness of the cross. This is God humbly bearing the sin, the fallibilities of his people. And it conditions how God appears. To the degree that God's doing that, he appears ugly. He appears corresponding to the ugliness of the sin that he's bearing. But the beautiful things that you find throughout the Bible. And there are amazing Christ-like, pictures of God in the Old Testament, as well as in the New Testament, of course. And that points then to the love that is revealed on this cross. By means of stooping this far, God stoops. When I read like the story of Jericho, where Moses believed that Yahweh said, "Go kill them all, slaughter them all," and then they go out and do that. What that story used to be nothing but irritating to me. Pure irritation. How could it be otherwise? And show no mercy. He explicitly says, "Show no mercy. Kill every man, woman, child, and even the animals." But according to Deuteronomy, spare the trees. They haven't done anything wrong. You think that might apply to little babies too. But now, to me, it's a cruciform story. Look how low God was willing to go. I mean, think of the pain it would involve God in to see his people going out and slaughtering people. Now that I knew that God is Jesus Christ, and that's the character of God, how it would have to grieve him. But he stays in the game to continue to influence them in the direction of truth. So the condescension, when you come to ugly stuff in the Bible, the condescension is the revelation. That God in his love is willing to stoop this much, which is exactly what we find on the cross. The condescension is the revelation. God stoops an infinite distance to enter into solidarity with us sinners. And that infinite distance reveals the infinite perfection of the love that God is.
Yeah. No, great.
So, I'd like to just sum up. I would like to just sum something up, Chris, just to make sure that people listening aren't misunderstanding here. So I think for a lot of people hearing this could be shocking. Like, how could someone who loves Jesus, who loves the Bible, believe that it could have mistakes in it? I think many Christians have never considered something like that before.
Yeah.
But what I'm hearing you say is, you still believe the Bible is from God, the whole Bible.
Absolutely. Fully inspired.
You still believe it's inspired by God. Absolutely. And that we need it.
Absolutely. Indispensable. It's our. So the question is, like, what kind of book would God inspire? Now, we always think that, if God's going to inspire a book, well, it must be a perfect book. Of course. It should have perfect grammar, for crying out loud, because I'm sure God knows perfect grammar. It should be the most beautiful text in the world. And I've had people, they're so convinced of that assumption that they'll hold up the Bible and they'll say, "This is the most beautiful book in the world." Now, I would say it's got the most beautiful story in the world in it, but there are sections in there that are not beautiful. That are not beautiful. Do you remember Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom? And there's, of course, you must have seen it. And there's one scene towards the end where he and this Nazi guy enter the room where they have all the chalices because they're looking for the Holy Grail. And so there's the wise keeper there, and so if you want to have the Holy Grail, you have to try it, but you have to choose very carefully, because if you choose the wrong chalice, you'll be destroyed. So the Nazi guy goes out there and he chooses the shiniest, brightest, most beautiful chalice, fit for a king. And he says, "Surely this is the chalice." So he gets the water up and he drinks it down, and then he melts. And it just disintegrates and turns to dust. And the wise man says, "He chose poorly." I love that line. He chose poorly. Then Indiana Jones' turn, and he wisely looks for the most humble cup in the whole place. This little tiny ordinary chalice, because this is fit for a carpenter. And he chose wisely. Well, the God who became a human being, a peasant, in the womb of an unwed young Jewish girl, and lives as a carpenter, and then lives among the poor and the outcasts, and is judged by the religious high and mighties and all that, and ends up dying a criminal's death on the cross. This is that reveals the character of God. This is the kind of humility, the kind of thing that he inspires. Jesus Christ is the ultimate example of inspiration, and the cross is a quintessential example of revelation. So God breathes that revelation through this humble, sin-bearing man. I would think we would expect God to breathe his revelation, since God's always the same. He'll breathe his revelations through very humble means. He chooses the weak things of this world to confound the wise. So we should expect a weak Bible. It's got weaknesses in it, but the weaknesses are part of its strength.
Yeah.
Because it shows God who comes down and mixes it up with us. Now, it does mean that we need to take care about how we read the Bible. And Jesus himself tells us that we're supposed to read the Bible in a way that points to him. Luke 24, all the prophets and law prophets have bore witness to me that the Son of Man must suffer. And 1 Corinthians 15:3, Jesus died according to all the scriptures. And N.T. Wright points this out. He doesn't mean that there's one or two scriptures that predict the crucifixion and resurrection, but the whole storyline is moving up towards this.
Mm-hmm.
In John 5, he says to the Pharisees, if you believed that Moses, you believe in me, because Moses was talking about me. And so we have to read it. Its ultimate purpose is to bring us into the story of Jesus Christ and to be caught up into that story and now to become part of that story. But if you're looking for science there or trying to decide how long it took to create the earth and things of those things, you're asking questions that the Bible, well, the authors weren't trying to answer those kind of questions, and God certainly wasn't trying to answer those kind of questions. So we have to read the Bible a little more carefully.
For sure. Chris, you jumped in there you put words in my mouth, but
sorry.
no,
I just wanted to make sure that our people were hearing that piece.
Because I was one of those people. When I first came across your argument or your presentation of divine inspiration, it was just kind of out of this world for me. But in your book, Cross Vision, you told this story, and I'm going off script here, but you told this story about this missionary couple.
Yeah.
Yeah, now you know what I'm talking about. So I'm wondering if you
tell
can
that story.
I wonder if you can tell that story, because for me, that just made this whole idea of condescending, or a better word that you used is accommodation. The way that God accommodates.
Sure.
If you can tell that story, to me, that was just powerful.
It's a good analogy. Well, so this was taught to me when I was at Bethel. A student told me the story, and it's about a friend of hers parents who were missionaries in some tribe in Africa. I don't know where it was, and I think it took place in the 70s. But they went to this tribe that was still practicing female circumcision, which is still being practiced in parts of Africa. And it's a ancient custom, but it's very barbaric, where they basically mutilate the genitals of young girls. And the main purpose is to preserve property rights for males, to ensure that they are virgins when they get married. And it's brutal and it's painful. So they go to this tribe, and but you can't just barge in there as Westerners and say, "Oh, stop that! That's wrong." They've been practicing this for hundreds of years, if not longer. And so, for 3 years, this missionary tribe just they loved on these people, gradually taught these people about the gospel, and just served them, and had to tolerate hearing the screams of young girls being mutilated. Because if they didn't tolerate it now, these girls in the future would have no hope. So because they hadn't earned the trust of the tribe yet. In fact, it almost looked like they could be accomplices, because they were able to bring in some Western medicine to give some anesthesia to the girls, and to use proper tools, and to teach us some things about infection to protect the girls. But to an outsider, it looks like, oh, these guys are really pro, female circumcision. It was only after about 3 years, where the tribe had now learned enough of the gospel and had accepted the gospel to a degree where they began to think for themselves, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't be doing this to young girls to increase males' property rights. And within a couple of months, the practice came to an end.
Wow.
But now you got to imagine that, say someone was writing the story, someone in the tribe was recording all the behavior of the doctors when they first arrived. And as you read that, it would look like these guys completely agree with this. They're helping us practice female circumcision. They believe in male superiority as evidenced by their actions. Only after they discover the true character and the true will of these missionaries could they now look back and see and understand how painful it must have been for them to endure those 3 years. And now they would see that it was love. Out of love, they were humbly accommodating this barbaric practice for the purpose of eventually being able to reveal that this practice has got to go. That, I think, is exactly what God does with humanity.
Amen.
Bingo.
Amen.
So if again, my interest is always just to try to make things simple for our listeners. That is such a powerful story. So if that's the sort of the metaphor or analogy for what God did in the Old Testament, he was like that missionary to an ancient, barbaric, bloodthirsty
Absolutely.
people. And he was with them even when they were doing things that were disturbing and disgusting to him, so that in the end he could reveal Jesus to them. And then when we go back, we can see that he was being patient with them. It wasn't that he was condoning all of that stuff.
Right? And so here's where it was really important, where once the tribe gets the true character of these missionaries, and that's it, I'll go forward a couple generations, and maybe the missionaries aren't even around here longer, but they talk about them. When they read the journal from beginning to end, it'd be important for them to remember who the missionaries really were and what their intent was.
Yeah.
Instead of trusting the perspective of the tribal author who wrote this. And only if you trust in the character of the missionaries can you see how they were being loving by accommodating this. So also, we've got to lock it in that God is as beautiful as Jesus Christ. And now when we read the Bible, trust that that is true. And you'll see something very different going on throughout the whole Bible story. Mm-hmm. And so now the whole Bible can become beautiful. In the same way that the ugliness of the cross reveals the beauty of God, some of the ugly stories of the Bible reveal just how low God was willing to go to stay in relationship with people.
That is so powerful. And I imagine right away, if someone from this tribe came along 10 years later after the missionaries were gone, or 20 years or 30 years after they're gone or something, and they read this journal and then they say, oh no, wait, this is what the missionaries want us to do. We need to go back to do this barbaric practice because look, they participated in it. And the answer would be, no, you missed the point.
Yep.
They did participate in it, but only temporarily to get these people to a place where they would reject it.
Right. It's and that's what love always does. You accommodate things. When you're married, you have to accommodate things. We adjust, and maybe there's imperfections, but you can either accept the imperfections or nag the person the rest of your life. It's love accommodates. But I think the main, there's a testimony I got from this lady after I gave this presentation one time, and I think it really captures the importance of this topic. She came up and she was in tears. She's a old Mennonite lady in my church, just a sweetheart Mennonite gal. Comes from a real conservative.
We like Mennonites.
Yeah, and she comes from real conservative. She still wears the bonnet and stuff, but she comes to our church and she loves our theology. We got a lot of Mennonites like that here. But she's about 70 years old, and she came up and she was crying, and she just said, all my life, I felt like, Jesus was the man of my dreams. Like it'd be like if I meet the perfect man to be my husband, and he just, check all the boxes. This is beautiful, but it's as if it'd be the same as if I found out that 30 years ago he slaughtered a classroom full of children. That's what I felt like my relationship with God was like. I love Jesus, but how were you capable of telling people to slaughter children? How could you ever? And she says, I always held a little bit of my heart back. I could never fully trust a man who slaughtered a classroom of children. I don't care how wonderful he is today. And I couldn't fully trust a God who could command people to slaughter children. I don't care how long ago it was. But this gave her permission to fully put her heart into God, to fully commit, to fully just fall in love. And it was beautiful.
So now we're going to run out of time here. This has been so wonderful, Greg, by the way. And Chris, know that you have another question or two, but this just makes me think of something. So now, because I can hear some of our listeners saying, okay, yeah, but Greg, then if that's the case, then we can just make the Bible say whatever we want, because we can just read the Bible and say, well, oh, that part wasn't God, or that part was just them, or whatever. What would you say to that kind of an objection?
Yeah. This is not cherry picking what you like and not liking. The criteria is always Jesus Christ. And the one who gave us that criteria is Jesus Christ. This is the lens by which we read the Bible. Now, I think we got to take all of it very, very seriously, digging into it. And I tried to do that in Cross Vision and in Crucifixion of the Warrior God. And what amazed me was that when I put on that lens and started really digging down into these stories, I found that more often than not, even when they depict God as doing nasty stuff, if you look at the scriptures carefully, you'll find that they give us indications to believe that it wasn't God at all. It was other agents carrying these things out, but the violence gets attributed to God. And the reason the violence of others gets attributed to God is that in the ancient Near East, attributing violence to God was part of your worship. Everybody did it. To take pride in your own violence was wrong. You have to attribute that stuff to God. And no, it's a form of worship.
Yeah.
And it really, man, you start reading this ancient Near Eastern text, it was almost a contest of the macabre. Like, whose God is more gory than others? It's my God will eat your babies and drink their blood, and you find some of that in the Bible. But it softens some. You have the same kind of ancient Eastern imagery, but it gets softened. God doesn't come down and consume his enemies like you find the God of not doing in Canaan. But you still got his arrows that devour flesh, and so they just kind of give a little step removed. But I was just amazed to find that there's these other agents at work that carry out the violence, even though they ascribe it all to God. And I wasn't the first to do it, because Paul does it in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 10, when he talks about the grumblers who were destroyed by a destroying angel. Now, the main grumbler account is the one with Korah's rebellion. And then you go back and read that account, and you don't find any avenging angel. But what you do find is the earth swallowing up people. And according to a lot of ancient Eastern scholars, well, we know that the Canaanites believed that there was this god, Mot, M-O-T, that lived underneath the earth, and his jaws reached up to the top of the earth. And sometimes he would devour people. And so they believed that the earth was itself a sinister being, or at least there was a sinister being that lived inside the earth. And it's probably how they explained earthquakes and things like that. But it says that the earth opened up its mouth. And then it says that the people ran in terror, saying, let's run, lest the earth devour us. No one's afraid of God. They're afraid of the earth. And this is, I argue, an ancient way of thinking about demonic presences. We identify principalities and powers and demons and things like that. But ancient Near Eastern people, they thought about it as the earth, or they thought about it as hostile waters, or sea monsters. You got Leviathan and other sea monsters out there. It was just their way of depicting it. But you find that all over the place in the Bible once you put on these lenses.
That is just so awesome. Greg, maybe just to bring this to a close, can you tell us why this view of God and the way that he inspires Scripture, why is that so important to you?
Well, it's the view of God is important because your view of God is the most important fact of your life. Your mental picture of God, because all your feelings towards God, your entire relationship with God, is mediated by your mental conception of God, and your life is going to be impacted according to your mental conception of God. So I tell people that the beauty of your relationship with God and the beauty of your life will never outrun the beauty of your mental conception of God. And so it's so important that we purge our minds. We've all inherited garbage about God, and it runs on autopilot, so we don't even notice it. But we wonder why we don't feel in love with God, or why we feel flat or angry or whatever. It's because of our mental picture of God. So I encourage people to lock it in, that the cross reveals the character of God. Other-oriented, self-sacrificial, kinetic love, pouring out love. And then it's important. This view of the Bible, I think, is important simply because it's the only way I know how to get consistent with that conception of God. Otherwise, you come into what most people do is, Jesus reveals this beautiful side of God, but yet there's also he can do genocide and does, and push it all together, just mush it together.
Yeah.
And so people have conflicted pictures of God, like that lady. She couldn't fully love God because, well, she thought God commanded genocide. And so it's about congruity and consistency, and it's also about having a view of the Bible that is defensible, so that our young people stop losing their faith over finding out that it's got some errors in it.
Well, Greg, your love for Jesus, your love for Scripture, your love for God have just bled through this whole time. We loved it.
Oh, thanks.
I was looking forward to this interview. Thank you for taking time with us. For everybody listening, we're glad you listened. The reason we do this Outside the Walls podcast is to expose everyone here to people who have new perspectives and fresh perspectives. So think about what you've heard here today. Pray about it. Study the Scriptures and see what God shows you. Thanks again, Greg and Chris, and we'll see you guys all again soon.
We'll
Thank
do
you,
it again.
Greg. Really appreciate
Peace
it.
out.
All right, bye. All right, friend. Thank you again for checking us out. We hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did, and that you come back in 2 weeks for our next episode. Again, please help us out by liking, subscribing, and sharing this podcast as future episodes come out. If you have any questions, please let us know at outsidethewalls@crossviewchurch.ca. Thank you, and we'll see you again.